A lot of people have some problems with the Mad Queen arc for Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, but some people do make the argument that Daenerys going mad was foreshadowed early on and that Daenerys' madness was being hinted at even more heavily, especially when we got into those later seasons. One of the scenes that a lot of people would like to point to is Daenerys killing Randyll and Dickon Tarly. And I actually don't have a problem with that scene itself in a vacuum. Rather, I have a problem with what they are trying to tell us is happening in that scene, what the showrunners are trying to communicate to us. And this is actually a pretty confusing scene as far as what is being communicated to the audience. And if this is something that the showrunners are using to suggest Daenerys is on a Mad Queen arc, the one thing that would need to be clear is that killing the Tarlys is wrong, or at least morally ambiguous, and the moral compass as defined within the show's world needs to be at odds with what Daenerys' actions are. We know as an audience what is right, what is wrong, or what is right even if it feels wrong, or what is wrong even if it does feel right. So remember moments like Cersei blowing up everyone at the Sept of Baelor. It might feel right because the High Sparrow was an unlikable character, so it might feel right, but we do know what she does is wrong. Or consider Jon killing those that conspired to kill him, especially Ollie. Jon having them killed for mutiny feels wrong, but it is right. Those who conspired against him technically committed treason against their Lord Commander. So let's remember those scenes as we understand the justification or lack of justification for Daenerys. While it is true that she refused to take them as prisoners, Randyll Tarly refused to bend the knee after clearly he must have yielded in battle, which is interesting. He then refuses to accept being sentenced to the Night's Watch. And yeah, okay, you could say that taking them prisoner for a while would give them time to reconsider, but if you're going to suggest Daenerys acted wildly or irrationally, she considered multiple other options for the Tarlys and they refused. But another issue I have is that this is all framed in a way that ignores what Randyll Tarly actually knows and believes anyway. Randyll calls her a foreign invader when he knows she is not, and that's why he won't accept her as his queen. Keep this in mind, the Tarlys were loyal to the Targaryens during Robert's rebellion. It is known that Daenerys was born on Dragonstone. Anyway, I think that this scene is one too flawed to point to if you're looking for hints of Daenerys being evil or mad. They're at war, and this man betrayed the Tyrells to support Cersei after she blew up his liege lord in the Sept of Baelor, along with the rightful Queen Margaery. The only thing crazy or mad is that Daenerys was even willing to accept the Tarly's sworn fealty to begin with, because they clearly cannot be trusted. So pretty early into this video, I am arriving at the conclusion that killing Randyll Tarly and Dickon is justified, at least in the world presented in a Game of Thrones. No matter who is making this decision, we need to consider the facts. The Tarlys refuse to bend the knee, and they refuse to acknowledge Daenerys' authority or claim as queen. The problem is not that everything was rushed. The problem is not that Daenerys goes mad. The reason this does not feel right is because it is manufactured. And in that scene, where we can objectively say what Daenerys did is in line with what other characters have done, and Daenerys, in the eyes of those that believe the Mad Queen arc worked or was satisfying, they have to reframe the rules that the story has already offered for other characters. What I'm saying is that to point to these moments like Daenerys burning the Tarlys as evidence or foreshadowing, you're forcing the character, Daenerys, to adhere to rules that are not applicable to other characters. That seems unreasonable. There is nothing especially or uniquely cruel or unusual about any of the violent acts committed by Daenerys or in her name before Season 8. She is just framed differently, but her actual actions are not obscene. People make the argument that Daenerys always committed unjustified acts of violence, but because these acts were committed to characters we did not like, we overlook that this was her madness being foreshadowed. But to that I would also say, or I would ask, was the mass killing of the Freys foreshadowing Arya going mad? Was Sansa feeding Ramsay to his hounds foreshadowing her madness? No, of course not. So why would mass killings or revenge exclusively apply to Daenerys going mad? You can't uniquely condemn Daenerys for actions that are considered reasonable by others. But why does this almost work? Does it almost work? I'd say yeah, in a way, but not in a good way. Daenerys has become almost unrecognizable. She's not relatable or sympathetic after season 6. So what happened? Well, for one, she stopped being the primary point of view that the audience experienced. Everything begins to be framed from Tyrion's perspective or even Varys' perspective. But we're no longer getting Daenerys seeking counsel or even battling with herself about what is the right thing to do. So no matter what she does, whether we understand or agree, we're not connected to her reasoning. We're actually becoming more connected to how the other characters are responding to her, and we're being alienated from her in a lot of ways. But this is what I mean by the character's turn being manufactured. Daenerys' coldness toward the Tarlys doesn't feel unreasonable, but we are simply told it was unreasonable through Tyrion's perspective. There becomes a much bigger emphasis on questioning Daenerys' actions, while those same types of actions can be committed by other characters without scrutiny. And now look, something does change in Daenerys' portrayal. It's not that her desire to kill her enemies has enhanced, but the balance to her character has disappeared. Whatever her impulses, she was able to be reasoned with, but more importantly, her character was in conflict with her own options, rain fire upon her enemies or find diplomacy. But to lean into one or the other entirely was always met with her own reluctance, while now in season 7 and 8, that reluctance is no longer her own. The hero-turned-villain arc is very much parallel to the redemption arc, but on the opposite end of the spectrum. If you look at Jaime or Theon, as we spend time with these characters maturing beyond their vile actions, we're connected with them and can feel the change in their outlook. We connect with their traumas, their reasoning for the horrible decisions they made, and we connect with their desire for atonement. The problem with Daenerys isn't whether or not the show correctly foreshadowed her Mad Queen arc or not, is that we as an audience are not connected with her as she makes this transition. Her motives are no longer things we can feel or understand. Breaking the wheel sounds like an objectively good thing, but Westeros does not have the blatant evils of human slavery as they do in Essos, so the corruption is much less clear, and it makes it more nuanced. Daenerys' motives are much more disconnected than, say, the motives of Jon Snow. With Jon Snow, we know the enemy and obstacle he is facing and preparing to fight. And I think this is why in season 7, when she meets Jon, we get that scene of her proclaiming she was born to rule the 7 kingdoms. It's almost as if the primary thing motivating Daenerys has become her ego. While that may not be the best reason to become a ruler, it is certainly not suggesting a Mad Queen arc. Keep in mind that we have already been told of Aerys Targaryen and what drove him into madness. Often it was betrayal or perceived betrayal that drove his paranoia. Eventually he found enemies in thin air. Daenerys is not experiencing this. She may encounter grief, but grief and madness are not synonymous. Her path of destiny that she references in season 7 and 8, for whatever reason, seems to feel different to the audience when compared to similar beliefs she expressed in earlier seasons. And while it'd be great if the story was making a profound claim about seeking power, that statement is never made. It's obvious that Daenerys' vanity is hinting at something. Maybe not burning down the city, but she is moving toward an unlikable path. And to be sure that the audience begins to distrust her, Daenerys' vanity and impatience to pursue her crown and titles and her authority is a direct contrast to Jon Snow, someone whose entitlements are never prioritized for himself. And that's fine. We do need to see that contrast, but we arrived here so quickly and with just not near enough time in Daenerys' descent. At least not firsthand. We don't get to experience her descent with her. We're watching it through Tyrion's eyes. And only showing Daenerys' action as wrong through the eyes of another protagonist in Tyrion, as an audience, we watch that from a biased perspective. We take our guidance from Tyrion. When Tyrion and Varys last speak in season 8, it is clear that Varys has accurately assessed the situation, that Tyrion will not openly agree with him, and the audience knows that Tyrion knows Varys has valid concerns. But we're not arriving here independently as an audience. We are simply agreeing with a carefully framed idea of who Daenerys is turning into, whether we understand, whether we agree, or whether or not we buy this as an organic development for her character. If you remember early and often in Game of Thrones, the morally gray character is at the heart of so much of the character's journey. Where we were able to consider nuance for every horrible decision, that nuance is no longer permitted here in the final 2 seasons for Daenerys. It's obvious she's going bad. It's what the show wants us to believe. It's not vague. But what's worse is that we didn't arrive at this antagonist place with Daenerys. She got there on her own without us, off screen. She got here and we didn't get to participate. We didn't get to feel it too, and it was inconsistent. When Viserion dies, Daenerys commits her power to defend the North, which is a good thing. When Rhaegal and Missandei die, she chooses to rule with fear, which is obviously a bad thing. And there's nothing fundamentally different that informs the audience of an exception for either direction. And it's this, among other things, that I believe ruined the Mad Queen arc.